Hello again, this is Priya from NCII. I'm joined by Rob from NCII, and we'd like to give you a quick tour of the series of guides that are part of the Advancing Equity Through Guided Pathways series. There are a series of 11 guides, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can spend just a few minutes giving you an overview. On this page, you'll go ahead and find all of the guides with both PDFs and PowerPoints for each of the guides that you can use either individually or as a team at your institutions. After an introduction that talks a little bit about the importance and urgency of sharpening the equity focus in our guided pathways design and implementation, we actually want to walk you through the series of guides here. So Rob, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I'm going to take the first four guides, Priya, and just really quickly, we had an order of these guides that was different when we released them in April of 2020. And our thinking at the time in April was that we wanted to get the student experience as the center of this work first. So there are really 7 guides that are kind of grounded in the student experience and looking at the student experience with an equity lens. And there are 4 guides that are more focused on institutional culture. After we released the guides, got some feedback, did some reflection after the spate of racist events and the country's response to it in recent weeks and how so many people are trying to explore these issues, we made the decision to reorder the guides and move them, the culture guides first. And so I'll talk briefly about the 4 guides. I mean, the first guide, our good friends at the United Negro College Fund, Nadrea Njoku and Deshaun Preston, who we know through the National Pathways Collaborative, offered to help author an institutional self-assessment for equity. As with all of these guides, they kept it short, right? There are many great resources out there that are much more deep and longer that look at equity, but the goal of our friends from UNCF was to keep this relatively short. It's an 11-item institutional self-assessment that you can kind of quickly reflect on where your institution is with the intersection of equity and pathways. The guides 2 through 4 work on leadership and culture. It's interesting, we had this idea early on to write a guide on what it would be like to lead culture change around equity as a white CEO, and to have these conversations and be able to be champions and allies in the cause of equity, leading as a white CEO. And one of our, actually the whole room of folks in our convening that we talked about in the previous video clips that raised their hands and said, hey, you know, it's not actually easier to talk about equity when you are a leader of color. So what was born was this idea to write 2 guides. One from Michael Baston, the president of SUNY Rockland, with an introduction from Kay McClenny that talks about leading culture change from the perspective of CEO of color. I would argue that these 2 guides are not just for CEOs, they're for anyone who's thinking about leadership. And then the guide number 3 is written on leading culture change with perspectives from a white CEO, and that's from Bill Scroggins, the president at Mount San Antonio College in California. And the 4th guide is on culture, also takes a really hard look at the issue of faculty diversity. You travel around the country, everyone talks about the need to diversify faculty. Although, as we just said, our white colleagues can be champions for equity and can be leaders of equity, there is a disconnect between our student populations in community colleges and our faculty diversity, to the tune of, I think one of the numbers I saw, that roughly 83% of community college faculty are whites, and certainly nowhere near 83% of community college students are white. And so Ed kind of provides some practical short suggestions to address this challenge. And that particular guide is very edgy, and he's going to tell you need to really address the isms straight on. So I think all 3 of these guides together, along with the self-assessment, paints a good foundational picture of culture around these equity through pathways issues. So Priya, you want to take the next student experience focused ones?
Absolutely. So the remaining guides, guides 5 through 11, are really centered in the student experience. So while we can design guided pathways to look a certain way, we have to be very mindful that part of our design is the intentional or unintentional impact of how students actually experience guided pathways. And so we use the framework of the Lost Momentum framework that came out of the Completion by Design initiative almost a decade ago, that really organizes the student experience into 4 stages, beginning with connection, then moving to entry, then moving to progress and completion, and then moving to advancement in the workforce or into further education. And so these 4 phases of the student experience is kind of how we aligned guides 5 through 11. It's also important to note that guides 5 through 11 speak to the first 3 phases until completion. And then there are references to advancement. We have yet to continue on to the advancement stage right now. So let me just walk through the guides themselves. So guide 5 is really about, it's called supporting students from application to the first day of classes. And it talks about all the different interactions a student has with the institution before they step into the first day of classes. This one was co-authored by Juliana Barnes, and it's really kind of a guide that offers some considerations about those different interactions and what it would look like to support students in that sense of belonging and connection from the very, very beginning. And to kind of build on that, we have guide number 6 called Creating Student Connection and Belonging Upon Entry. This is co-written by Amelia Parnell from NASPA, which is the Student Affairs Administrators Association, and also Kay McClenny from NCII. And this guide is really talking about how to boost that sense of belonging, that sense of connection, and very importantly, talking about how you can establish trust and how the very first impressions a student has of the institution really speak to the student's ability to trust their experience at the institution. Guide 7 was around taking an asset-based approach to student onboarding. This one is co-written by Sunny Cook at Miracosta College and myself. And this one is really talking about how to reinforce the strengths and the assets that students come in with. And so to shift from that deficit mindset to more of an asset-based and a strengths-based mindset about what students can bring in. And we really center the guide around the work by Dr. Laura Rendon around the validation theory as well. Guide number 8 is on reducing student equity gaps in transfer level math and English attainment. It's written by Robert Vela from San Antonio College, as well as Kathy Booth from West Ed. And this one is really talking about the different types of curricular innovations like acceleration, contextualization, as well as the approach that multiple measures offers as a way to support students in making advancements in their math and English attainment at the institution. Guide number 9 is about reframing classroom instruction to engage a diverse community of students. This one is really, this was co-written again by Luis Panjuan from Texas A&M, as well as Kathy Booth from West Ed. And this one is talking a lot about how to support students in adapting to the variety and diversity of student learners, and how to be able to really support the complex student identities that the classroom holds, and also to introduce elements of the student-centered learning philosophy that they can use as well. Guide number 10 is a guide on creating active and culturally responsive learning environments for students. This one is written by Tia Brown McNair from AACNU and also co-authored with Rob here. And this one is really talking about ways to really lift up and make real what learning can look like in the classroom. And it offers different examples around applied learning and project-based experiences. And it's really steeped and centered in the critical race theory work that Tia kind of applies in the classroom experience. And then lastly, we have guide number 11, which is integrating non-academic supports into the student journey. We all know that no matter how well we can design our guided pathways, if we do not address the realities of students' broader lives, the real life challenges that can affect their ability to come in and stay in college, then we are only doing part of the work. And so this guide is really talking about the non-academic supports. And again, as Rob mentioned, this is not comprehensive. These are just lifting out a couple of different non-academic supports and seeing through what it would look like to integrate them into the student experience. So here, Linda Garcia from CESI and myself, we co-authored this and talk a lot about, again, that sense of belonging, supporting and growing that academic mindset, and then also talking about this very critical field around basic needs support that get into such fundamental needs of food security, housing security, healthcare, childcare, transportation, etc. And so these collection of 7 guides are really around placing the equity focus of guided pathways directly in the student experience and what it looks like from the student perspective as they enter. And again, not as students as monoliths, but students as diverse sets of learners, students that are first generation, students of color, different historically marginalized student groups, and what that would look like in the student experience. So to help you kind of walk through one of the guides, we thought that maybe selecting a guide and showing you what it looks like would be able to help. And we thought that maybe discussion guide number 10 around building active and culturally responsive learning environments would be a great place to start.
Yeah, Priya, and so I think what you'll find in each, again, the guides are short. They're intentionally short. English professors, we apologize, but very few people want to read 25-page papers anymore. And the timing of this is that we're trying to provide these guides as a way to start conversations. And so we've offered these guides up. They walk through, as we mentioned earlier, a set of content that's a couple of pages long, 2 to 3 pages long. There are some key ideas in there. There are some strategies. This particular guide, you know, the key ideas is that, I mean, AAC&U has done some amazing work historically on active learning and high impact practices, and this kind of using the equity lens to drive this into the classroom, and talk about the approaches that meaningfully engage students with course material and with each other, and that culturally responsive teaching that empowers students to kind of relate that coursework to their lived experience and backgrounds. One of my favorite statements in all of the guides is in this guide, where Tia talks about making sure we avoid using the experience of white students as the baseline against which the lived experience of our historically marginalized students, especially Black and brown students, as the baseline is really important. We can't make that assumption that we are trying to bring students of color into the mainstream by having them experience things the way white students do. So it's a very important lens into this work. She talks about, some of her strategies talk about self-reflection. How do our own lived experiences and values, assumptions, and bias impact us as we are, in this particular case, in the classroom? And then, you know, we move in each of these guides. You'll see as Priya's moving through, you have introduction, you have a reflection, you move down in the guides, and you'll see that this moves on to a set of discussion questions. And the discussion questions on this guide, that, I mean, there's always 3 to 5 of these. Some of them are one question that actually has 3 sub-questions, but in this particular one, you have a longer list. But, you know, you look at questions like, I think number 4, how did my lived experiences, my worldviews, my preconceived notions, my biases, and my values manifest in my teaching strategies and decision-making? That's hard, self-reflective work. It's vulnerable work. It's uncomfortable work, but I think it is a great way to start conversations. And, you know, what does it mean for me to be an active learner as an educator? And that's, I think these are important guides. And then we see some research tasks here that, you know, I like the one that said, what are mechanisms exist for learning about the student experiences at your college in the classroom? And so the guides all follow this same kind of progression, that especially the second 7 really follow it. The first 4 are a little bit different in that they are exploring kind of cultural issues. But each of these guides have a PowerPoint associated with them from number 4 through number 11. We're actually going to get PowerPoints up for the first 3 guides soon. But you'll find PowerPoints that you can take today and use. And we really think of these guides as very workshoppable, that you can take them into settings and use them. And as our friend Michael Baston said, we have to make sure that we're making steps, not statements, that we are moving past just using the discussion points to discuss things, but then move to action. But of course, those kind of, that foundational thing the discussion questions can do for us, and these research tasks to help start these really challenging conversations is what we are aiming for here. And so with that, I think we want to end this quick exploration of the guides. We are always open to your feedback, to your insight. This is hopefully the first 11 of a longer set of guides. Priya mentioned we did not have any guides on the advancement phase this time. We just had to make choices. And as I mentioned earlier, we wanted 6 to 8, we got 11. And we love the fact that we have these 11 guides. And so if you have ideas about them, some things you think we could explore, please share them with us. Rob at NCII-improve.com, Priya at NCII-improve.com. And with that, we'll sign off and hope that you enjoy the guides. And we can't wait to hear back from you about how you use them, what works really well, and what might improve them in the future. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.